Washington, and Congressman Adam Schiff, a ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee, joining us. All right, now, is this just people sticking out their chest, or is there something real here, Congressman?
Well, I think it's the Russians' effort to once, for the last time probably during this presidency, poke the president in the eye. We've been having discussions with the Russians for years. The problem hasn't been whether we have discussions with them. The problem has been that they've been largely fruitless. The Russians really had no interest in resolving the Syrian conflict on anything but their own terms. So I think they went through the facade of talking with us and negotiating, but really what they wanted to do was buy time to bomb opponents of the Assad regime, to further cement the Assad regime's position in Syria. And now, having accomplished that, they're basically ending the charade and saying, you know, we're really not talking to you because it's not going to change our minds at all.
You know, critics would say that Putin took advantage of us, he played us, we're naive, he sucker punched us. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think it's certainly true that Putin played us in the election by hacking our institutions, by dumping documents, by trying to influence the outcomes. And unfortunately, we had a candidate in Donald Trump who was willing to give the Russians deniability and is still giving the Russians deniability. At the same time, Democrats have to own some responsibility here, too. It was widely known that Russia was hacking our institutions and meddling in the election, and yet Democrats failed to persuade the American people why they should care about what the Russians were doing. So there's a lot of responsibility, but it was a very successful gambit by the Russians, and we're going to have to do a far better job not only defend against that kind of cyber intrusion, but in deterring the Russians from this kind of meddling future.
All right, Congressman, you're talking about cyber issues. I'm going back to the Syria issue, and that is there are people who think that Putin sucker punched us and led us along in Syria till he can reach every one of our goals while pretending to have conversations with us.
You know, I think that's true, and the challenge for Secretary Kerry, who, you know, worked harder than anyone to try to bring about a transition away from the Assad regime to end the bloodshed, is that the Secretary could never present the Russians with the "if you don't, then we will do this." There was no stick behind the negotiations, and so there's really no reason for the Russians to accommodate the United States or our interests or to try to reach agreement with Secretary Kerry as long as I think the Kremlin believed that President Obama wasn't willing to intervene more forcefully. There was really little reason for them to compromise. And so I think they did play rope-a-dope with us as well as with the United Nations. And the result was, unfortunately, the war was prolonged and hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next 29 days. It seems as though we're at a stalemate until the Trump administration comes forward. We'll see how the relations work out when that happens. But let's talk for a moment about what happened in Berlin, because it seems as though the goal was to destabilize the already troubled relations with Syria, with Russia and Turkey. As you know, they haven't been getting along. But it seems as though that didn't work. It seems like they're now working together as a result of this terrorist attack.
I think you're right. The assassination of the Russian ambassador in Turkey, I think was, if you take the assassin's words, was meant to express in a violent way the feeling of many Turks who are angry with the Russians for aiding the Assad regime, for bombing civilians. At the same time, it might have been an attempt to drive a wedge between Russia and Turkey, as we saw take place when the Turks shot down a Russian aircraft. But that hasn't been the response, and one of the things that I think is very troubling about the Turkish response to this is that the Turkish pro-government newspapers are running stories suggesting that the United States, through our intelligence agencies, was behind the assassination. And this is a card that Turks always play, which is to blame the United States, blame the West, sometimes blame the Jews. And it shows, I think, what a low point our relationship is with Turkey, that for this kind of an assassination they would blame the United States.
Look into the future for a moment in your crystal ball. With Trump becoming president, we seemingly are going to change our relationship with Russia, with Putin. So project for us what you think will happen.
I think in the near term there will be a lot of nice things said between Trump and Putin. There may be some effort by the Trump administration, frankly, that I would resist, to relax sanctions on Russia and to work more hand in hand with Russia in Syria, which I think will also be a problem because their goal of defeating ISIS and Al-Qaeda is secondary to their goal of propping up the regime. But in the longer term, I think inevitably Trump and Putin are going to clash because the Russian interests are really inconsistent with our own interests, and that's going to become apparent to the president-elect. And I think you could have a very strong confrontation. These are two, I think, authoritarian leaning figures, certainly an authoritarian in Putin, but someone who has those instincts in Trump. And you could see a real collision taking place with very unknown consequences. So it's a big roll of the dice in trying to change Russia policy this way. But in electing Trump, we're going to have a very different approach to Russia.
Right. It won't just be a clash of policies. It could also be a clash of personalities, no doubt. Congressman Schiff, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Happy holidays.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.